My name is Christina Dorset, and I'm your moderator this evening. And I will be introducing the panelists in a moment, but first, I would like to introduce one of our alumni. Adia McKnight led a wonderful meditation for the Black Excellence Summit that was in February. And I enjoyed it so much that I asked her to do something similar for this event. She is one of our Widener alumni, and she was class of 2021. So Adia, please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the event. So first, we're going to be starting off with a sound healing meditation, and the name of it is Be Fully Present. So a lot of people believe that when you meditate, you have to let your brain zone out, but that's actually not true at all. What you just want to do is just make sure that you're sitting in a very comfortable position, and you just want to be fully present, and you just want to make sure that you inhale and you exhale, and you just focus on the sounds intently. And if your mind starts to wander off, bring it right back in and just be fully present in the moment. So I'm going to share my sound, and I am going to be playing the sound healing meditation right now. And if you want, you can even close your eyes during this, anything that you want to do to make yourself feel comfortable. So that will be the end of our sound healing meditation. I hope that everybody enjoyed that. I know that definitely after doing that, I felt a lot calmer. And if you're ever interested in looking up sound healing meditation, you can always, go to Spotify and actually find the Be Fully Present, what I was just playing just now. Thank you.
Thank you, Adia. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was pretty much exactly what I needed to sort of shut off my workday brain and get into the right mindset. So thank you. Now that we are all in the right headspace, I would like to introduce our panel of experts, beginning with Brooke. Brooke DeCipio has her PhD from Widener University in human sexuality. She is a sexologist who uses healthy sexuality education to help prevent gender-based violence on college campuses. She currently directs the Office of Gender Violence Education and Support at Lehigh University, where she specializes in consent, pleasure, trauma, Title IX, sexuality education, and healthy relationships. She's the co-developer of the Culturally Competent Sex Communication Model for Consent Education. Welcome back to Widener, Brooke. Thank you so much for being part of this panel. The Office of Gender Violence Education and Support at Lehigh University is an example of the ways academic institutions can implement sexual consent education on campus. What benefits have you seen through the development of this program, and how has it been received by your students?
Thank you all so much for having me. Super excited to be doing this today. So for the question, it's a both and for me, because there are both federal and state regulations that require universities to be doing consent education, and it is a best practice in the field to be including consent into gender-based violence prevention and healthy sexuality education. I don't So this might be a little controversial, but I actually am advocating that we start to move away from consent education and more towards a comprehensive, like, sexuality, sex communication education model. And so, like, one of the things that I've seen, so my co-researcher Christina Plati and I have been doing research on consent on college campuses for the past decade. And one of the things that has happened that we're seeing in our research, because consent programming has become a mandated programming on college campuses, is that consent has almost become like a dirty word for college students. So it's become like a check the box type of thing. We will literally have students in our interviews say things like, I only do it so that I don't get in trouble or don't get accused of rape, right? So, like, it's not about the sexual experience or the pleasure or the partner. It's about not getting in trouble. And the other thing that we were seeing in our research is that students can define consent, so they know what it is, because we've been doing a really good job educating about it, but they are not implementing it into practice. So, like, it's not translating over to behavior, even though they cognitively and by definition know what it is. And then the third thing that I think is getting in the way is it's not valued on college campuses. So you'll hear a lot of times from survivors about, right, like, my perpetrator was a resident advisor who was trained on this stuff and knew what consent is, they just didn't care. Right. And so it's not something that is valued on college campuses in the way that lots of sexual partners are, or popularity is. And so one of the things we're doing at Lehigh is we've shifted away to doing consent education, and we're using the sex communication model that is really helping students figure out what their own attitudes and beliefs are about sexuality and relationships and consent. Like, what are their own sexual desires and preferences, and right, like, exploring their own sexuality. And then how do you communicate that to partners, and how do you make sure that you're doing it in a way that changes every time you're with a different partner, right? Because it's not a, right, like, again, check the box where you figured it out and now you're good to go. It's something that changes throughout your lifetime. And so that seems to be really well received. And it is becoming more about, if I'm sexually communicating with my partners, the consent is happening naturally. So when I'm saying, like, let's try this position, or that feels good, or I want to do this, like, that's all part of getting consent, but it's part of the natural conversation that is happening when you're having an intimate experience with someone. And I'll stop there.
No, thank you. That was great. Okay, our next panelist is Joey Brodsky. He is an educator, trainer, and organizer rooted in West Philadelphia. He is currently an education specialist at WAR Philadelphia Center Against Sexual Violence, where he works towards a world without gender-based violence through community education and relational organizing. While not on the job, he can be found in the woods chasing squirrels with his dog Noodle. Thank you for coming, Joey.
Thank you for having us, or me, yeah.
WAR is a Philadelphia-based nonprofit with a mission to end sexual violence through direct services, education, and outreach. What role does education play in breaking through the cultural structure that we call toxic masculinity?
Yeah, thank you for that one. So it's a big question, right? But I think when done in tandem with both like structural and efforts for systemic change, I think education can play a big role in moving away from toxic masculinity. I think especially when it comes to working with men and masculine identified folks, which is what I do a lot of, educational spaces are super pivotal for folks to build relationships with people that are doing similar work. And that can help with the feelings of social isolation that so often accompany starting to notice rape culture. And then when those feelings can intensify when starting to actually, call out and speak up within your social circles, because just what, as Brooke was saying, right, like, alternatives to the culture we have are not valued. They're not that popular, and they sometimes can come with those risks of being isolated, which is not the same as experiencing sexual violence, right? And it's still a worthwhile thing to do, but it's also something I'm thinking a lot about in terms of how we can build educational spaces that are holding folks and they're able to scale up to having like many folks starting to build alternatives, right? So educational spaces can expose us to other ways of being and relating to each other. They can help us build tangible skills like that effective communication, like bystander intervention, like how can you stay emotionally present in a conversation with a friend who's caused harm, and so much more. So I think there's so many different things that educational spaces and education can offer, but I think it's the best when it's part of that structural and systemic change. So you can analyze the efforts you just made, see how it's working, and then start that cycle, over and over again.
Thank you, Joey. That's awesome. I can't wait to hear more. The third panelist that I will be introducing today is Molly Wolf. She is the head of research and instructional services at Widener University. In 2009, she founded the Widener University Sexuality Archives with the mission to preserve the history of sexuality. Molly is passionate about the intersection of librarianship and sexuality, and she lives with her family outside of Philadelphia. Thank you for being part of the panel, Molly.
Thank you for having me.
So Widener University's Sexuality Archives began 15 years ago and has collected and preserved thousands of items related to the history of sexuality, sexology, and sexual education. What are the benefits of preserving historical materials such as these when our society's views on sex and consent have evolved?
So I think that there is a twofold reason, or maybe multiple reasons. I think we need to know where we have come from. Right? If those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it, right? Why do we find ourselves in the situations that we're in today? Why does our society have the issues, or why are we dealing with the issues that we're dealing with today? Well, we have to look at the cultural artifacts of past generations. We have to look at, and in relation to sexuality, sexuality education curricula that were used. How were these concepts around sexuality, around consent, around gender and identities and things like that, how were they taught? What were the messages that were received? So I think it's important to look at where we have come from. I also think it's important to provide context. So I think we all suffer a little bit from what I call the temporal scope problem, is that we think that our generation or our time is the first one to have these problems, or the people who invented a certain issue, or, you know, I get questions from students, when did people start doing X sexually? The beginning of time, actually. But, you know, to have artifacts that say that, to look at sexuality education curricula from the 80s and can be able to compare them to sexuality education curricula today and see how they have changed, or in some cases not changed, I think is really valuable. And, you know, some of the older materials that we think of as being antiquated or very conservative or restrictive, they might not be. There are, you know, we find materials that are way more quote unquote progressive and liberal than we would ever give the past credit for. So I think being able to put these things into context and to be able to see the messages that were given to, say, my generation, generations behind me, can inform how we educate the future generations.
Excellent, thank you. So this next part is going to be some group questions that we'll have discussion about. But for the people who are in attendance, if you have questions, you can send them to us through the chat. Chloe DeFlameri is going to be handling the questions that come in through the chat. So please send them to them. They should be able to receive it. They are created as a co-host. So if you do have questions during this discussion, please send them their way. We will take questions from the live chat at the end. So this is the first group question. It is for all of the panelists. And here we go. In your opinion, what makes sexual consent difficult to interpret or demonstrate?
I can start, and then if folks want to jump in or add to it. So I think from my perspective, one of the problems is that folks don't have experience with this, right? Like, it's not something I know, like in the advertisement for this event, folks were mentioning like we're moving towards T consent, right, which is referring to like the consent is T video. So for folks that haven't seen it, it's a video where they're little stick figures and they're comparing like having someone over for tea to sexual consent. And folks like love this video. Educators loved it and used it a lot. I don't like it. And the reason is, right, like we do pizza night every night in our house on Fridays. And we have a conversation with the kids around like, what do you want on your pizza tonight? Are we having pepperoni? Or are we having plain? When we go out to a restaurant, a server asks them like, what are you having to drink tonight? I ask them, are you having milk or juice? So they have opportunities their whole lives to practice having a beverage with someone. We don't do that for sex, right? Like I don't say to my 5-year-old, what makes you feel good? Like what brings you pleasure? What positions do you like, right? Like, so we don't normalize those conversations. And so I don't think consent is as easy as T, because we don't have those opportunities to practice and engage in that. And so it requires folks to be really vulnerable in those moments. And we don't give them the space and time to think about like, what are their boundaries? What are the things they enjoy? What brings them pleasure? You know, we don't, even in really good comprehensive sex education programs, we focus on reproduction and STIs and sexual health. Like we don't tend to focus on pleasure. And so one, I don't think folks have the education and skills to do consent, which is what makes it hard. And then add on to that, it's super nuanced and complicated, and it changes based on your culture. So a really good example of this is one of the focus groups we were doing. Students were talking about how if someone comes over after a party and takes their shoes off, that's a sign they want to have sex. right? Like you're taking your shoes off, so it's easier to get your clothes off. So that means you want to have sex. And other students in the group were like, in my culture, you take your shoes off when you go to someone's house because that's a sign of respect. Like, what are you talking about? So there's also these like cultural differences, and we use really coded language and we use innuendos, right? Like, do you want to go home with me? Do you want to smoke up with me? Like, those are all things that folks say to initiate an intimate encounter, which get lost in translation. And then add to all of this that folks are often using nonverbals. There's often on college campuses alcohol or other drugs involved, which makes it harder to interpret signals, particularly nonverbals. So I think those are some of the things that make consent really nuanced and complicated.
Yeah, I definitely want to, I think, add on to, agreeing with all of those, right? It's like when consent is like a felt sense and not just like a permission. Yeah, like I think it's really hard to figure out, yeah, like when have I felt like this? What's, we don't give people, an opportunity to, sit down for 10 minutes through a guided meditation on a time where they felt like consent. How did they know that, it was there? How did it meet your five senses? What did it sound like? What did it taste like? What did it feel like? Right. So when we're really, giving folks, the space to do those things, I think it can get a little bit easier to, to interpret, when you're experiencing consent. So I think, things like that. So not necessarily even, like otherworldly things, right? Just thinking about, and, times and even feeling into, can you replicate that feeling now? I think can be really helpful, in dealing with some of those difficulties.
Absolutely. I agree 100% with what Brooke and Joey said. I also think that we have really few sparse, maybe, examples in our popular culture of what good consent, or what this conversation, what this negotiation looks like. What we see in our rom-coms, or even just our roms, our romance movies, is a lot of I'm not interested in you. Person A is saying, I'm not interested in you, person B. Person B is going to pursue this person through wacky antics and all of these things. And then person, A is going to be won over in the end. Well, in real life, is that how that works, or is that stalking? A little column A, little column B. So we don't really have good examples. And then when you look at pornography, which certainly people are watching and are using as educational tools, even though that's not exactly what it is intended to be, we know that these conversations happen, but they don't happen on screen, at least in mainstream porn. So there literally is no modeling of this. Isn't certainly something that I won't say always, but generally people don't see their parents modeling this behavior. They don't see it in their popular media. They don't see it in their pornography. So, they have nothing to base it off of. So it's really picking up very nuanced things and developing this set of skills yourself. That's very difficult, whether it's knitting or, trying to negotiate pleasure with a partner.
I will also add, just based on what Molly and Joey are both talking about, I think you also can't have this conversation without thinking about the roles that like the gender binary plays in this, and the sexual scripts that we're given. Because I also think like that is right, like around sexual consent, it's a very male female binary, right, where men are the initiators, women are the gatekeepers. It's often not inclusive of LGBTQ plus individuals. And I will often hear like the male students that I work with will say things like, we're basically set up to be perpetrators, right? Because like we get the messaging that you initiate and you negotiate past the no. And right, like that's what it means to be a man. Whereas women will often say in conversations, like, even if I want to say no, like I feel like I have to say yes because I don't want to upset the person, or vice versa. Like if I want to do something, I don't feel like I can speak up about it because I'll be slut shamed. So I think the sexual scripts within the gender binary also really impact why consent can be difficult.
Yeah, like men are taught to ask, what can I do? Or like, like, can I do this? Rather than like, what feels good? Like, what are your needs right now? So like broadening that to just, can I take this step further in this linear, already thought out, maybe baseball metaphor, right? Rather than like, yeah, like what feels good here for everybody? Like, can we talk about it? Like, can we slow down? Like, this, that, are you sure? Like, oh yeah, like was that actually a yes? Like I saw your body language change a little bit. Like, it's like, really broadening that conversation to just like, can this next thing that we're supposed to get to, in quotations, right, happen?
All right. The next question is, are there situations and circumstances that automatically revoke consent? And what are some examples where consent is specifically not possible?
I feel like I'm talking a lot, so I'm happy to let one of the other panelists take this one. Um, but so typically when I'm doing programming, the three ways that we talk about consent getting revoked is when someone says no, stop. So they verbalize that they no longer are wanting to do something. Another way would be if folks verbals and nonverbals aren't matching up. So right, like their nonverbals change, so they might be saying they're okay with it, but they're shutting down, they're kind of closed off, they're seem uncomfortable. So verbals and nonverbals not matching up. Another way would be if active ongoing consent stops. So the person kind of just shuts down. So not really verbally or non-verbally giving that ongoing active consent. So that's a really important moment to stop and check in with partner. And then the last one we talk about that is often less obvious to students is if someone's state of incapacitation changes. So there's a really good example from Kathleen Vogel's book, Hookup, where she shares this interview from a student who's talking about like he took someone home, they're having sex, and in the middle of it, the partner is throwing up on the side of the bed and starts calling him the roommate's name. So right, like she wasn't showing signs of incapacitation and was able to consent, but then during sex, state of incapacitation changes, and so consent gets revoked at that point. And related to that, the ways that folks are not able to consent is if there is something that impairs their ability to do so. So someone has to be fully cognitive. They have to be free of force, coercion, threats, so empowered to be consenting. And so things that we would consider there would be someone's age, and different states have different ages for consent, but if someone's age doesn't allow them to consent, someone's ability doesn't allow them to consent, and then most commonly on college campuses, drugs and alcohol. Again, every university has a different policy around this and every state has different legislation, but typically folks are looking for, you can't consent if you're incapacitated. So you're looking for either signs of incapacitation or knowledge of incapacitation, which students don't think of. There's a really famous legal case where a student was sexually assaulted on a college campus, wasn't showing signs of incapacitation, but friends had told the perpetrator, like, my friend is really drunk, like don't go home with her. So that was considered notice of incapacitation. So those would be some things that would negate the ability to consent.
Yeah, and I think along with those and broadening a little bit, right? Like if you found out after the fact that you were manipulated, but you weren't aware, at the time, I think that can change the conversation around consent. Doesn't necessarily fall within like the established legal definitions of the consent if there were verbals that were matching and with nonverbals, they weren't capacitated, right? But if that was within a manipulative or an abusive relationship, or just a situation where they didn't know that, something wasn't actually what that partner said, right? I think that's a situation where consent is not there. So it's beyond just, the in the moment sort of, revoking of consent, but, if you were feeling great during it, but you woke up the next morning and you felt like your nervous system was shot, or you're having a response that feels similar to a time where like you've experienced violence, right? Thinking about, does that mean that there was consent for that, even though some of those other things were in line? And there might not be that exact yes or no there, but really just, hopefully, having the skills and the resources, to figure out, where can I go from here? And maybe to add, right, examples where like consent is not possible, like, I don't know, the first thing that's coming to mind is like thinking about, incarceration. Like, I don't like consent to participate in like clinical trials, right? Is that really consent? Right? If we're broadening it from just outside of, of intimacy, right? Like thinking about that power and that power imbalance, like, where is power control happening, right? That's where I think consent is not possible.
Okay, our next question. Parasocial relationships are one-sided relationships that usually develop from a fan to a famous person. Fame, I guess, could mean a few different things, but in the age of leaked nudes and accusations of influencers who are grooming minors, what role do parasocial relationships have in sexual consent?
I think it sort of furthers some of the messages that we get about like that are unhealthy about like how these things start, right? Sort of like the rom-com thing. It's like, well, like there's a chance if I like show up and I'm there and I keep showing up, then this can happen, or that I should expect this, or that the person that I'm seeing on social media is actually who this person is, in their actual life. So I think there are a lot of ways where it can, set us up for, not having the skills to actually communicate what's really going on in our lives, and also just to have unrealistic expectations of what to expect, from somebody.
This is interesting. This is never something that I have considered before now, but I think it's understanding the nuance of let's say, I'm posting this information, I'm consenting to have this Instagram account or to have an OnlyFans. I'm choosing, I'm the one in control here. I'm choosing to put up a nude or to share this photo or whatever with a person, as opposed to someone demanding that information or interpreting that as, okay, well, you've already made this, so this is okay, across the board. I'm thinking recently, if anybody saw Pam and Tommy on Hulu, this was a big theme that ran through that, about Pam Anderson and Tommy Lee, when their sex tape was leaked to the public, sold and posted online in the 90s. I'm dating myself. But they tried to sue, and basically it was, well, you've already posed nude in Playboy and in other places, so therefore, what does this matter? It's already out there. And so for me, the difference is you have the person choosing to do the post this information, and someone else then demanding, well, you need to post this, or you've already posted that, so me sending it out here to this other audience doesn't matter. So it's about, I think, who has the onus of control, and that consent to one situation does not consent to every situation. Just because a person, to extrapolate out, just because a person has said yes to making out, or to mutual masturbation or to, penile vaginal intercourse does not mean that they have consented to every other sex act in every other situation. Just because you're in bed with that person doesn't mean that the consent is one and done, right? It's a continual process, negotiation, conversation.
Just to like circle it back to college campuses, like most campuses have some type of sexual exploitation language in their sexual misconduct policies to help protect against some of this. Right. And what Molly's talking about, where it is the, like, what did you consent to? So even if you can, consensually shared nude photos with a partner, if partner shared that without consent, right, like that's a policy violation. So like, what did you consent to? Interestingly, the latest Title IX regs that came out in the summer of 2020 didn't include sexual exploitation in the required Title IX behaviors, but lots of institutions kept them because it's something that in the digital world we live in, it's something that's so relevant. And I also think this circles back to a bit about what Joey was talking about in the last question about the power relationship, because I do think that is something, particularly in the famous person fan dynamic. And right, like I know there's a question coming about Me Too movement, but like thinking about, like, do those famous positions create a power imbalance that then doesn't allow consent in those relationships? So I think that is another connection to what we've been talking about.
I'm not an expert on consent, but I could be an expert on random social media knowledge. There's one specific case. We're not going to have a question about it. It's really interesting. It's about this topic about two TikTok influencers, where there is footage of a female influencer being inappropriate with a male influencer while he was intoxicated. And she has made quite a few different responses to the situation in public. One of them was like an interpretive dance response. But I think that it's a really good situation to start a conversation about consent with, because it's very obvious listening. Her name, I think, is Sienna May, I believe. And hearing the way that she conceptualizes the violence that happened is really enlightening. I didn't want to go deep into it for any of these questions because I didn't want any of the panelists to have to do homework on social media, but that's kind of where the idea for like this question came from, because there's so many examples in social media right now of where we could have these topics and these talks about consent. So I love that we're actually able to have them here. So thank you for that. Thank you for indulging me on that. The next question, Generation Z or Gen Z is thought of as a progressive and socially aware generation. Does this mean that they inherently understand consent more than previous generations? And how has consent education changed within our society?
So I will talk about how consent education has changed a little bit because I have access to new sexuality education curricula, old sexuality education curricula. So interestingly enough, it has changed some, but not as much as you would hope. And so what we have in the past is a combination of things. We, of course, have, abstinence only curricula that basically don't talk about it at all. It just says, don't do it, right? We have a lot of no means no. And then we have some other things that may talk about, you know, conversations, and you should ask permission. The good ones, and they're few and far between, would not gender those conversations. But a lot of them are still, you know, men, you should ask permission before touching a woman, or, you know, those kind of things. Now we have the same combination of curricula out there. There's still abstinence-only curricula. There's still curricula that says just don't do it. There's still ones that exist that say just say no, or no means no. And there are more progressive ones now that talk more about the conversations. So yes, we have progressed, I think, in some ways. I think we're seeing less of these things, but honestly, I think it depends on the school district, the community, the state, the part of the country, what message, what predominant message is getting through. And I think that has probably been a constant over the last, let's say, 40 years.
I think the biggest change has been some states passing like affirmative consent legislation, but similar to what Molly is saying, it varies depending on the state and the region, and then even within that state, like where you are in the districts and things. But you know, California was the first state to pass affirmative consent legislation, so basically requiring college campuses to talk about affirmative consent in their programming on campus. And then they followed a year later by trickling it down to younger age groups, so high schools. After California passed, about 25 different states either passed or suggested or have conversations or something. But again, that's only half of the country, and not all of those 25 that did so moved forward with them. But that was a pretty monumental, like we'd never seen that legislation before. So California, when they did that back in 2014, like that was a pretty big deal for consent education programming.
And I think maybe one thing that has shifted is like with access to online archives and social media, and you know, I think some of the pockets that have been digging in deep and doing this work and are just interested in you know, building skills are able to do that, I think, in a deeper, different way. And then you've got, you know, the communities where folks aren't necessarily interested in this. This isn't a priority, and I think you see some of that stagnation there. And I think with Gen Z being a pretty online generation, right, I think you can see that, you know, that there are some things, right, that access to information has deepened an understanding of things. And just as, you know, any population or any generation, really, you can see that with access to rapid information, sometimes misinformation, you know, spreads just as quickly. So I don't think it's a definite, right? I don't know if any generation is inherently anything, right? They're like a product of the social conditions that, you know, that brought to them, and, you know, dealing with like lots of ongoing, you know, awful social issues, right, that, you know, they're sort of tasked with the future of dealing with. So I think, you know, that coupled with, you know, just, you know, having, just, you know, having more awareness of things and having that information, you know, readily, you know, accessible, means that, you know, folks are able to dig deeper in sort of whichever, you know, way that they would sort of without that.
I also, like, I think in response to the Gen Z part of the question, I also, like, anecdotally, I don't know that that is the case, because as Joey's saying, right, like they're like the tech native generation, and I think that almost sometimes makes it harder to translate it to in like physical intimacy in person. You know, like one of the things that I will often see with my students is the, you know, like I don't know how to like make friends. I don't know how to in person like interact with folks. And it, you know, it's so much easier to do it online. Or students will talk about, you know, like their fake Instagram accounts, and like their real Instagram account is their like fake profile, but their fake Instagram account is their real identity, because they're so much more comfortable being online than they are being in person sometimes. And so I almost, again, like I don't know the research to back this up, but anecdotally, like I would question whether or not it's actually made intimacy harder at times. And I think we're definitely seeing that post COVID. Um, at least with my students, like really struggling to form social relationships and have intimate relationships, after being completely virtual for the past 2 years. And for our first and second year classes, missing some of those really important high school social milestones has really impacted their intimate relationships now that they're in college. So I don't know.
And those same issues, I spend a lot of time virtually visiting elementary schools and middle schools, right? And those same things are showing up there, that we're seeing more anger, we're seeing less patience, we're seeing more issues with just bodily autonomy generally, right? So especially when we're thinking about consent education, I often think if we're really only locating it within higher education, right, we're probably a little bit too late. But so you're seeing these things as early as, as 5 years old, where we're seeing, some of the challenges, that only virtual, or that priority to that, experience is not translating.
Okay, we do have 3 more questions, and then we're going to be taking our questions from the audience. So if there are questions from the audience, please send those over to Chloe. The next one is, it's the one about Me Too that Brooke mentioned earlier. So living through the Me Too movement, which began with Tarana Burke in 2006, but gained momentum in 2017. It has shown us how the concept of rape and sexual assault has changed over time. We answered this a little bit, but what do you see as the future of sexual education after the Me Too movement?
I think for me, what do I see as the future of sexual education after Me Too is I think like some folks are unwilling to let certain things happen anymore. Right. And that's, I think, is really powerful. I think especially young people, like especially marginalized folks, are just not taking it anymore. Not that they ever have been, but there is, I think, a little bit more of a foothold within institutions, within folks that have power, that they know that they at least have to have a conversation. I'm not sure that we've gotten to, are we making structural changes yet? But that conversation is not as easy to sweep under the rug. I think that repression and that resistance is still showing up, but I think the folks that are most impacted, I think, one of the major things of experiencing sexual violence is how isolating it is, both like emotionally and like physically isolating. So I think when you see something like Me Too happen, you see that swell, you see it everywhere, folks that you never would have expected, that are just on your Facebook page posting Me Too, right? That I think can make you feel like, hey, I'm really not alone. I have folks at my back, and now I'm ready to, make some changes.
So I'm a little bit more pessimistic than Joey in that I am still really struggling with whether or not the Me Too movement has had any type of cultural change. And Molly said really early on in the conversation, right, like when you don't learn from history, survivors have been doing this for all of US history, right? Like if you look back to the 1800s and Racy Taylor, a Black woman who was gang raped in the Jim Crow South, right, like publicly came out and shared her story, putting her life in danger, right? So like survivors were speaking out publicly in the 1800s. We saw it in the 60s and 70s during, second wave feminism, when things like Take Back the Night marches and things started. I think Me Too is different in that it's utilizing social media, which is a way, as Joey's saying, for survivors to connect and find solidarity. And like, despite all of this, in the midst of Me Too, right? Like the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings happened, and Brock Turner was released from prison after 3 months for good behavior. Right? Like, so despite the Me Too movement, like the systemic change that needs to happen has not happened yet. And so I'm a little bit more pessimistic in that I think it's just going to continue. Like, what's going to be the next Me Too movement until like we systemically address the issues that are allowing these types of things to occur. And like even within the Me Too movement, you know, like survivors attacking each other around, you know, like your sexual harassment isn't as bad as my sexual assault, right? So there was some like in-group fighting happening. And I don't necessarily think it's inclusive of all identities, right? So like trans women often being excluded from some of the Me Too conversations. It was really upsetting in the beginning when Alyssa Milano tweeted and didn't give credit to Tarana Burke until like 3 days later. And so I don't know, I'm not as hopeful. And I think that there is a lot of really important work to be done. And we're just not there yet.
I'm surprised because nobody's ever said I'm hopeful about this, so I'll take it. Because like I think I really do feel similarly to how what you're saying, right? It's like cultural progress, right? I think changes in representation within systems, but systems themselves are not shifting. Like material conditions on the ground are not necessarily shifting. This wasn't like a movement that centered, you know, working class women or working class folks that have experienced sexual violence, right? Like, so yeah, I think you're definitely right with a lot of, you know, with what you're saying.
Yeah, I get the feeling, well, I'd like to think that it spurned a lot of conversations that maybe would not have happened other ways, because it was undeniable that it was, you know, every person you've ever met has been, you know, affected by sexual violence in one way or another. As far as translating those conversations into systematic change, I don't know. The pendulum swings both ways a lot in this country. We go from being, you know, things look very hopeful, they swing back the other way, maybe not. And it just looking from the text and the artifacts that we have from sexuality education and sexologists and things like that, it just goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you know, it never, I don't know, breaks off and moves on to the next thing. So I think we have a lot of work left to do, but it certainly started some conversations, and maybe, you know, a larger conversations or conversations in enclaves that would not have talked about it before. And so I am cautiously optimistic, but realistic, knowing that systems don't change easily.
Okay, this next question is something that I included because I could only find one resource about it, doing my own search. And I wanted to know more. So if someone thinks that they have violated another person's sexual consent, what should they do? Should they focus on preventing it from happening again, or would it be appropriate to ask for forgiveness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. And I think there's not necessarily, to me, there's for every circumstance, here are the 3 steps you should follow. Like, I think, you know, when it comes to responding, you know, if you violate another person's consent, right, did you have a conversation with that person ahead of time? If like, hey, if you, after the fact, if you're feeling like something's going on, like what's best for you? Or have you even checked in with, you know, with if you're even able to, right, if that person even wants to, you know, talk with you, like what feels best for you right now? Because when it comes to responding to somebody that's disclosed that they've experienced sexual violence, we want that person to be able to make as many decisions about how, how to proceed. We want that person to be driving the bus as much as possible, right? So if that's something that feels good, that feels like, within their own healing journey, it's something that, maybe, right? But it's not up to you as a person to cause harm to center what you think is best in that situation. It's up to, the person that has experienced that violence to have the agency to hopefully, be able to make as many decisions, within, the structures that we have.
I think a couple things that I would say for this one are, I would encourage person to talk to a confidential counselor, right? Because you're potentially disclosing a crime if you report to like someone at the school. And so being mindful, right, you're going to want a confidential space to kind of work through this. The other thing I would say is, I actually had this situation happen. So Me Too movement. So kind of as the Me Too movement was taking off, a student of mine who was sexually assaulted had graduated, was kind of moving on with her life, and perpetrator reached out to her in wake of Me Too to apologize. And it was devastating for her. She had put it behind her, like she was in a good space, and to hear from this person was not, like, it didn't make her feel better. And so I would encourage the offender to really think about, like, why are you doing this? Like, is it to clear your conscience or to make yourself feel better? And like, what is the impact you are having on that survivor? I would also say though, like, I think this is something that we're going to see a lot more of, because the new Title IX regs are allowing for informal mediation in a way that we haven't seen before. So like the restorative justice model and mediated conversations are something that are now allowable on college campuses. And so I'm imagining there will be some more types of these restorative conversations between survivors and perpetrators. Because folks are not wanting to go through the formal process. And so this gives them some recourse in a way that they haven't had before. But yeah, I think it is real, right? Like thinking about the motivation and the intent versus impact on survivors. And thinking about, like, is it, right, like, is it just a recognition and apology, or is it true behavioral change, right? Because that's a big difference. That's, my husband asked me, I hate Jameis Winston. Like, if Jameis Winston came out and acknowledged what he did and like apologized, and like, no, that wouldn't be enough, right? Like, it would mean helping to reform the system that allowed the rape kit to be covered up and allowed police to botch the investigation, right? Like, there would need to be some type of I think action and the change that we've been talking about, rather than just the like acknowledgement and apology. I don't think that changes things for survivors.
I was just letting my dog stop barking before I answered. Thank you for your patience. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think, like, and you'll even seeing that, off of college campuses, as like things like transformative justice and reformative justice are being named, right? You're seeing folks that are looking for alternatives to punitive measures, right? It's like, I want justice, I want healing, but I don't want to participate in a system that's reinforcing, discrimination. And like a lot of times with survivors that I'm looking or spending time with, what they're looking for out of the criminal justice legal system is not necessarily somebody to be put away, but they're looking for it to be taken seriously, and they're looking, and a lot of times looking to just being able to read their victim impact statement, right? And so it's like, I think there are ways where we can think about what are you really trying to get out of this situation when we only have one option, right? If that's what you want to choose, great, sure. But if there are other options that can also hold, some other ways of figuring this out, And if that's what you want as a survivor to pursue, sure, I want you to make that decision because that's what you think is best for yourself, because survivors are the experts in what's going to be best for them because it's their lives.
That was great. I really didn't know what the answer to that question would be, but that is really a good way of thinking it, is framing it as exactly what the survivor needs. So yeah, that was really enlightening. Thank you. We do have one last prepared question, and then we're going to be taking questions from the audience. And this one is kind of a big one, even though it's small words. But it's something that's really important because, as Molly said, every single person has been impacted by sexual violence. Me Too was something that showed us that. There are definitely people in this room who have been affected by it. I've been personally affected by it. So, what are your top 3 resources for the survivors who have experienced sexual violence?
I mean, there is a lot of options, and Joey is talking about empowering survivors and giving them choice back, and so that's often right. Like, give them as much choice as possible so that they can make a choice that feels right for them. But there are certainly national resources. So organizations like RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, is a 24/7, 365 hotline that's available nationally. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center, so NSVRC, has a lot of really good materials on their website for survivors, but also for friends and family about how to support your survivor. Every state has a national, and Joey, I feel like you should be answering this because you're part of one of these organizations, but every state has a coalition that basically lists all of the organizations in the state. So for example, in Pennsylvania, it's PCAR, and then within each county, there is a local, it depends on the county. Sometimes you have separate agencies for sexual assault survivors and domestic violence. Sometimes they're combined. But so each state has a clearinghouse of sorts that shares the information for each county. And then on college campuses, all campuses are required to have a Title IX coordinator. Oftentimes, just like disclaimer, Title IX coordinators are required to be fair and unbiased. So oftentimes they're not doing that survivor support piece, but they are able to talk through options and resources and process options and reporting options. Lots of campuses have folks like my role that are specifically designed to believe and support survivors. Folks most of the time are going to work with friends or family first. Their often first disclosure is to a friend, and that first disclosure is so important because depending on how folks react to that is going to often determine kind of their trajectory from there. And so we know that when someone receives initial belief and support, they are more likely to seek further resources, they're more likely to report, they're more likely to move through a process. So yeah, I feel like Joey, you should add here.
Yeah, happy to. And I yes to all of what you're saying, especially about like your friends and your family and community members. Those are very much likely going to be the first ones to that receive a disclosure. And then when it comes to Pennsylvania, we are one of like the only few states that have both a PC ADV, like Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and then a Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. So if you're in another state, you can likely find every type of center for gender-based violence a little bit easier than if you are in Pennsylvania. But every county will at least have one center. In Philadelphia, WAR is the only rape crisis center, but there are 4 DV centers where you can get similar services. I know, what county is Widener in? Delaware County.
We're
I
in
know
Delaware County.
I know there's DAP, there's some which is in media, which is a domestic violence agency. I know that there's Delaware County Victim Services as well. So you have a different range of resources as well. Yeah. And I think maybe I can add context. So what would you get with those resources, right? So like most resources, most, especially with WAR, right? We offer free trauma counseling for folks that have experienced sexual violence and significant others, right? So that's, if it's your partner or if it's your child, or if it's somebody that you have a significant relationship with. We offer, court accompaniment, which I think is also offered within Delaware County too. And yeah, so those are like the main sort of like survivor support. And then also, if you want to go and get like a rape kit or rape examination done within Philadelphia, you can have a medical accompaniment be with you at the PSARC, facility yourself. You can have somebody from WAR that is always there with you throughout that process.
And if we were talking about people inside of the Widener community, we have the counseling center, we have the student health center, we obviously have a Title IX person, but there are people who are maybe better equipped to handle frontline kind of things, than they are. So, and then, depending on what it is, the local emergency room can provide referrals to resources as well as medical care.
Yeah, and if you only remember one hotline number, the RAIN hotline number is a great one because they're used to catching things nationally, and then, okay, where are you actually right now? Connecting you to that county-based resource. So I think, starting from there, if, calling a hotline is what feels best at that moment, that's a good one to start with.
And some of the national hotlines are also doing like text services, because I know it's super uncomfortable for students to call. So they'll also do where you can like online message or you can text or things to get support as well. So that's often a comforting option for students who don't want to make that phone call.
And don't ever be like ashamed or afraid to reach out, because it really is a process. It's not just right after that you might need support. You may need support a year later, 10 years later, whenever you're comfortable and whenever you need it. Please don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. I think that's something that all of us can agree on. So we do have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So I'm going to introduce the person who is asking those questions. This is Chloe DeFermieri, and they are actually one of the student collaborators for this event. So this event was the brainchild of Chloe and their peers. They have assisted with every part of creating this panel. And so I want to take this opportunity to say thank you and give you props for coming up with this. I do want to say thank you to the Widener chapter of Amnesty International and the Widener History Club. So, and of course, Wolf Graham Library, who also co-sponsored this event. So, Chloe, do we have a few questions from our audience?
Yeah, we do. The first question received was from Lombuso Koza. The question is, how is global behavior discussed per this topic, as consent is defined differently around the world?
So I can jump in. It is, I think, particularly on college campuses where you have students who are coming from all over the world. So international students, domestic students who are going abroad. So certainly something that is part of these conversations. And because so in my experience, right, like it's impossible to speak to every culture in a session. And so how do we then give students the skills to be able to translate and interpret other folks' cultures or other folks' right, like messaging around this, so you don't necessarily have to know, like, here is the language or the specific cultural scripts for this country or this population or this person, but I have the skills to be able to have those conversations to figure that out. Because I right, like we do programming for our international students, and there will be 100 different countries represented in the room, and right, like how do you speak to all of those in 60 minutes? You can't. But we can give them the skills to have those conversations and the awareness that these things do differ and matter depending on the culture that you're a part of. And I would say not just even globally, but even like within the US, depending on what part of the country you come from, or like what your personal background is, like this stuff is really going to matter. um and so I think being able to navigate any culture is really important for these skills.
Yeah, I think sort of what I would add there is right. It's like making sure that we're not centering the like white middle class understanding of consent as like the global model. And I think, just that naming that I think is really important, and just making sure that we're not projecting and then like we're not reinforcing, like those cultural, just letting some cars drive by, not reinforcing, that problematic power imbalance when it comes to things like, cultural imperialism and things like that.
I can share concretely, like one of the things that we do is we'll do an activity where we'll give a prompt around consent, right? So like in my culture, typically we consent using like explicit verbal language, and we'll have the students kind of move to along a continuum in the room of kind of what that looks like in their country, so other students can see the variation, but then they can also have conversations like amongst each other of how it looks different, depending on folks' experiences. So like that's one of the like a concrete activity that we'll do to generate some of these conversations, right, to help, as Joey's saying, right, to make sure that we are not just talking about like white college students and what it looks like for them, but so opening that up for other experiences and examples and conversations in the space.
All right, I'm going to transition us to our next question from Kayla Van Austin. Question for the panelists. You touched on this a little, but is there much research done on consent within same-sex couples? I'm curious to know if or how power dynamics or other elements of the research differ compared to heterosexual couples and consent.
So I can speak to somewhat of the historical perspective because I'm coming here as an archivist. Most of what we have access to and most of what we have as far as sexuality education curricula and sexuality education textbooks and conversations around or artifacts around consent are heteronormative. It does not mean that these things don't exist, but the inclusivity of sexual orientations that are non-heteronormative sexual orientations is relatively recent when we look at commercially available sexuality education curricula, textbooks, things like that. Does the research exist? I'm sure it does. Somewhere. I don't think we have quite as much of it as we do for heterosexual couples, but only because we are still a heteronormative culture. And so that is what people tend to focus on.
maybe add just one thing, and it's not necessarily like research based because I don't do research, but just what we're seeing at like centers, right? We're seeing that like no matter your identity, like folks are experiencing and causing sexual violence. So the need is definitely there. It's not like, cool, I'm queer, I'm in this queer community, I'm not going to experience sexual violence, right? Things are internalized, there's still power imbalances. We exist within a society that's, you know, that has a power normative hierarchy in pretty much every culture we're going to be in. And those things are helping to replicate you know, like patriarchy and sexual violence. So it's like the need for this is definitely there because we are seeing folks of all identities and demographics both experiencing and causing, you know, harm.
And there is research. So we know that trans identified folks experience higher rates of gender-based violence. We know that bisexual women experience the highest rates of gender-based violence. So there is research to support that folks' gender identities and sexual orientations intersect with gender-based violence. And you are starting to see programs that are specifically tailored to prevention for LGBTQ plus communities. So there is, but again, like those programs are new, and so like there's not research yet to support the effectiveness of those programs, but there is, like, because we know that some of those identities experience at higher rates, there are some programs that are prevention programming that is now specifically targeting LGBTQ plus gender-based violence. So like we do the Define It program on my campus, which is a consciousness raising, but again, like we're just starting to like collect that data, and interestingly, it's not as effective within LGBTQ plus communities as it is within cis hetero communities. So it has more of an impact of folks who identify as cisgender and heterosexual than it does on folks who identify within the LGBTQ plus community. So
All right, thank you for sharing. I'm going to move to our final question sent from Taylor Easter. I have a question. It's also been touched on, but was curious about how the panelists think that sex education and consent will evolve on college campuses in the future, and what changes they think we'll be seeing in coming years.
I mean, I feel like, Brooke, this is probably the perfect question for you, but I will chime in what I hope to see. I hope to see us move from really, I'd like to see us almost move away from quote unquote consent and move more towards just communication and conversations. Because it's not about, well, I think these things, because they are nuanced, because they change when you change partners and situations and instances and times of day and things like that, and cultures, I think that having skills to have a conversation, uncomfortable conversation even, around pleasure, and does this feel good, does this feel good, what do you want, I saw you cringe, what does that mean, and even things like that means decentering yourself in the conversation. Yeah, this feels great for me, but I see you're wincing. What does that mean? Talk to me about that. I'd like to see us do more of those sort of how to have uncomfortable conversations, how to have negotiations, and modeling that behavior, because what does that look like is a little more, I think, realistic and what we encounter out in the world than no means no, yes means yes. Even the enthusiastic consent model, I don't think really touches on all of the nuances that are involved in partnered behavior, intimate partner behavior.
I mean, I appreciate that Molly just shared all of that, right? Because that's where, like I said at the beginning, we're heading, is away from the consent towards the sex communication model. Again, I feel like I'm so pessimistic, but I I think we're heading towards an even bigger divide, because I think depending on the school you're at and where you are in the country, I think some schools are taking a step backwards. And then I think there are other regions and areas where folks are moving in the direction that Molly is talking about. And Molly had mentioned earlier, like that pendulum swing. That is also going to continue to happen. Because depending on like what's going on with federal and state regulations for education around these topics, like that's going to continue to shift this. So like right now, the Biden administration is trying to undo some of the Title IX regs that happened under the Trump administration, and the next administration is going to swing it back the other way, right? So like that's gonna, and it makes it really hard on educators, because we spend so much of our time having to adjust to like the required mandated programming, and then we can't do the forward thinking progressive programming that actually makes a difference that we would like to do. I think bystander programs are going to continue to be like a foundational thing, because that's one of the things that everyone can agree on. Like no matter where you are on the pendulum, everyone can get behind bystander. There's a lot of prepackaged ones out there, so it's easy to purchase one and implement it on your campus. I also think like it matters that we have folks who are educated on these topics to be able to offer this programming. So is the field of gender balance prevention and sex education being decentralized in a way that folks of various identities and backgrounds and financial circumstances can get an education to be able to educate others? So I think that matters. And I think universities need to commit funding and staffing and resources to this. So for example, I'm a single person office on my campus with no budget, right? So like that is like, how do you do this programming in that situation? And so colleges and universities need to commit to caring about this issue, and that means providing staff and funding so that this programming can happen, which again, I don't think we're there. I think oftentimes it is like someone from the counseling center is being asked to do this as an add-on, or right, like, or a student group is being asked to do it. And so that is going to be, I think for this to go anywhere, like you have to commit the person power and the resources and the finances to move this along.
And a lot of times us at the centers look at college jobs as like, great, this I could be a little less stressful. I could get paid a little bit more. And then you hear as to, what it really can be like. But in terms of where do I think it's going? I hope it goes to more to individual skills, right? Those communication, but also placing like sex and consent within, broader conversations on boundaries, on attuning to other people's needs, onto like emotional development for men, like so many similar things, right? Building cultures of consent, not just skills, how to navigate these conversations, but like, what does it look like if we actually value a different way of relating to each other because we have a culture that supports it? There's, there are ways for me to engage in athletics that are not reinforcing that locker room, rape culture, right? So like figuring out how we can scale things that are supportive to folks that, that are looking to make these changes, but are looking to do that and still stay in community with other folks.
The one thing that I would add too, so like an ask of all of you is, how do you start these conversations like in your lives and with younger people, like as my 2-year-old is on the screen over here, right? Like these are conversations that we have with them around like, you don't have to hug or kiss anyone you don't want to. Like even when Grandpappy is like, give me a kiss, like, no, it's, could I have a kiss, right? So like those are things that I think helps to shift this, because then if you go to a school or you end up on a college campus that doesn't have good programming, like this is stuff that you've been hearing since you were a little kid, and some of that education and messaging and valuing of these things is there already. And that's something that as a community, like we all have the power to do, is like if you go to a family gathering, like not forcing a child to give you a hug, so these are things that we could be doing in our everyday lives to help shift some of this. So I would encourage you all to think about, like, are there ways that you could help us in this work? So
That's actually, I know Joey brought up earlier talking about working with elementary schools and middle schools, and Brooke, what you just said, one of the ways that I think that we can get to the culture in higher ed that we want is by starting the work much earlier. Beginning the conversation when someone is 18, 19, 20, 21, it's not impossible, but it's really too late. Developing that culture starts much earlier. It starts in elementary school. It starts in toddlerhood. It starts, having these conversations in an elementary school, in a middle school setting, in a high school setting, before these people come to a college campus. And I think that it's the responsibility of all of us to have these conversations with our peers. We know that peer education is very, very beneficial, and that it's very impactful. And we look at it certainly in school settings, but I think that we all can do this kind of work in whatever peer groups we have. So I'm the parent of a young teenager. He's 14. Aren't we lucky? He knows everything. It's great. Makes my life so much easier. But I have these conversations with him. He has these conversations with his friends. I have these conversations with his friends' parents. Because maybe they're not. So I talk to my mom friends about having these conversations with their kids, even though they're not sexually active. It's not, well, at least that's what the moms are telling me. It's not just about when you're ready to hop in bed with somebody. It's about everything, leading up to that moment. So I think we can do this work to get to the culture that we want to see. But we have to do it sort of all the time in every situation that we find ourselves in. And we certainly have that power.
And just as we're wrapping up, as a Widener student, I would say we have a great deal of work to do, like an overwhelming systemic amount of work to do. And I would be interested if anyone in this call, you can contact me at any point. I'm going to drop my email. If anyone wants to do continued programming, this is something that I feel particularly passionate about, and I would like to do continued work on. So I'm sure we all had similar experiences. Like, Widener does not handle these issues well, and it's something that we are going to need to be working on together in the years to come, for sure.
That actually brings me to my next point. I did want to thank all of our panelists for agreeing to come and to be a part of this panel. I really appreciated it. I hope that everyone else has as well. But if people do want to get in touch with you, what are the best ways to contact each of you individually? Chloe's thrown in their email in the chat, but for our panelists as well. And an email in the chat works as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I can chat to everybody. I think it would just go to co-hosts, but joey@woar.org. That's where you find me. And Chloe, if you or any other folks are like, hey, what can we do? Like, feel free to shoot me an email. We can chat. Was at one point a college student that did some campus organizing around gender, and would love to chat and connect with you.
Chloe was nice enough to throw my email in the chat, but email is always great. If anybody is interested in looking at historical artifacts of presentations of consent, or just around sexuality, the Sexuality Archives is available. I'm happy to give people tours, let you poke around, look at some of the things, to see concrete examples of how the pendulum has swung back and forth, and what we used to teach and how it's different or not so different from what we're teaching today. Just let me know, and I'm happy to show you around.
Chloe also popped my email into the chat for you all. It's bed4@Lehigh. My students joke because it's bed for, and I'm the sex lady on campus. It's an accident. It's just my initials. But yeah, so bed4@Lehigh. Thanks, Chloe.
All right, thank you, Chloe, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope that you've enjoyed this. It will be made available on our YouTube channel with full captions within the next 2 weeks. So thank you, and I hope you have a great night.